Hi everyone, and welcome to my video where I try to pick apart how Avengers Endgame messed up the timeline. This is a bit late to the party, but here we are. For the purpose of this video, I'm only looking at the Marvel Universe up until the end of Endgame, though I might mention other MCU films or shows like the Loki series. I haven't watched all the Marvel post-Endgame universe, so maybe they tried to address some of these issues later and I don't know about it. Warning, spoilers for all the MCU films that came out before Avengers Endgame, and the Loki TV series. Disclaimer, this video is for the purposes of review and commentary. Writing a time travel is always tricky and it can take on a lot of different forms. In Endgame, they mentioned time travel stories like Back to the Future, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Star Trek, and Hot Tub Time Machine, to name a few. And even in just these 4 other series, we see different theories of how time travel can affect that character's universe. In Avengers Endgame, time travel is not really different. That is to say that it is different. What I mean is, time travel in Endgame is a little bit different than we've seen in other movies, but just like the other movies, they do have their own theory on time travel. Let me know if you want me to compare Endgame time travel to the time travel from those other movies and TV shows, specifically the ones mentioned in Endgame. But this is not that video because I did not want to make this video incredibly long, which is what would have happened. Okay, here we go. Here we have the MCU timeline. You can see Endgame there at the end, which takes place in 2023. And here are all the films with the years that the movies take place. Not the release year of the film, but the year that it is more or less in the movie. You can see some of these movies cross over into multiple years, and these dates are according to GamesRadar.com. Avengers 3 Part 1, which is Infinity War, takes place in 2018 when the blip happens at the end. And Avengers 3 Part 2, Endgame, starts back in 2018. The remaining Avengers come together, they go after Thanos, and they try to take the Infinity Stones to reverse the blip. However, Thanos had already destroyed the stones when the Avengers caught up to him, and Thor cuts off his head. So the MCU original timeline, Thanos, dies in 2018. The rest of Endgame takes place 5 years later in 2023. So, in 2023, the remaining Avengers get together again to travel back in time and gather the Infinity Stones from before Thanos got them all in 2018. After some strategizing, they figure out that they know enough about the stones' whereabouts to travel back to 3 different years in order to gather all the stones. Captain America, Iron Man, and Ant-Man go back to 2012. That's the same day as the events in Avengers 1 to get the Mind Stone, which was in Loki's staff. The Space Stone is actually the Tesseract, and the Time Stone was with the Ancient One before the Doctor Strange movie took place, before Doctor Strange even met these people. Thor and Rocket go back to 2013 to get the Reality Stone, which at the time was inside Jane Foster. She was on Asgard as seen in Thor 2: The Dark World. Lastly, Nebula and War Machine go to 2014 to pick up the Power Stone that you might remember seeing as that purple stone that Star-Lord got at the beginning of Guardians of the Galaxy Part 1. Hawkeye and Black Widow also went back to 2014 with them, but they got on a spaceship to go to the planet where the Soul Stone was. So of course this plan goes to hell, starting with Loki escaping in 2012 with the Space Stone, the Tesseract, instead of the stone being taken to Asgard along with Loki as a prisoner, which is how Avengers, the original Avengers, ends. So this creates an offshoot in the timeline, and that we see in Loki Season 1, it gets taken care of right away. The Time Variance Authority, or TVA, erases the timeline, this offshoot timeline that was created, and that Loki lives on in the Disney Plus series through some shenanigans that I won't get into. So new plan, the 2012 time-traveling Avengers, they sent Ant-Man back to 2023. Meanwhile, Iron Man and Captain America, they go back in time even further to somewhere in the 1970s. That's because they knew that about this time, the government had possession of the Tesseract as well as some of Hank Pym's time-traveling particle juice. So kill two birds with one stone. They can get the Tesseract, which they lost because Loki ran away with it, and they can get more of the time travel vials so they can go back to 2023. Now, to travel back in time, the Avengers were using some particles from Hank Pym, the senior Ant-Man, if you will, Michael Douglas, and they only had a limited amount of vials for time travel, which means they can't just jump back another few minutes to try to get the stone back because they won't have enough time travel juice to go back to 2023. But Loki escaping in 2012 isn't the only thing that goes wrong. It turns out, because Nebula is kind of like an android cyborg, when they go back to 2014, evil Nebula was able to hack into good Nebula's brain because of some weird interference going on when the two existed in the same time space, which was 2014. So Thanos figures out the entire plan that the Avengers are doing, and he sends evil Nebula to pretend to be good Nebula, sends her back with the other Avengers to 2023, or sends her to the future to 2023. Time travel is confusing. So now, after all the Avengers gather back into 2023, everybody's got every Infinity Stone. Everybody's busy trying to recreate the snap and undo what Thanos did. Meanwhile, evil Nebula is bringing the 2014 Thanos, Gamora, and a whole bunch of their crew into 2023. So here's another potential timeline offshoot. And maybe this was sold to TV at some point, but we have yet to see because season 2 hasn't come out yet. And then 2014 Thanos is the one that gets killed in 2023 Endgame. So at this point, Thanos has died twice. Original Thanos, our Thanos, died in 2018. But then the Thanos from 2014 that went to the 2023 future dies. So that means that Infinity War never happened, right? In this new timeline, because Thanos never got the stones, he's just dead. Side note, our Gamora, the original Gamora, died in 2018 with the whole Soul Stone thing. But this 2014 Gamora is now alive and living in our original MCU timeline. Okay, moving on. So after they defeat Thanos in 2023, they have to return the Infinity Stones to the original years that they got them from in order to avoid, quote, messing up the timeline. I mean, I wrote it in quotes. I don't think they said it, but I wrote it in quotes. They're trying to avoid messing up the timeline. I think it's a little late for that, and I think they messed up the timeline anyway. Also, how can they actually mess up the timeline? Doesn't the Hulk explain that they can't, no matter what they do? Is the Ancient One talking only about the multiverse and not the timeline that they're living in? Maybe the Avengers actually got the stones from different universes and messed up them, or they always got them from those timelines and so they're not messing up those timelines because that's how it went. And I know I haven't gotten to Captain America returning the stones yet, but no matter what I say, I seriously have a very hard time believing that he could have returned the stones without anybody noticing and not messed up the timeline. Seriously, the TVA must hate the Avengers. Side note, let's talk a minute about Hank Pym's unintentional time travel juice. I don't think that's what's the original reason why he made it. It's just unintentionally, you can time travel with it. So in order to return the stones, Hank Pym from 2023, once he got unsnapped, would have had to have made more of his particles so they could try and travel back to return the stones, right? Wait, why didn't they just make more? They could have probably figured out how to do it, right? I mean, if they're time traveling, that means they have all the time in the world. No, if Tony can figure out how to time travel with the particles, he can figure out how to make the particles. Okay, back to the show. Captain America, Steve Rogers, goes back in time to return all the stones from when and where they got them. Well, I believe this can fix many timeline issues. I'm not sure how Steve can fix the no Infinity War timeline. He would have to knock original Nebula out as soon as she got to 2014 and send her back to 2023 before she woke up and before 2014 Thanos realized what was going on. So that's a maybe. Let me break that down. If Steve doesn't try to stop 2014 Thanos time jumping to 2023, then there is an alternate timeline where Infinity War never happened, everyone lives, and who knows what else might be different. If Steve does try to strategically stop 2014 Thanos from jumping from 2014 to 2023 by taking down Nebula, then the original timeline stays. However, if Steve goes to 2014, knocks out Nebula, sends her to 2023, after 2014 Nebula and 2014 Thanos realize that something's wrong, then we can't possibly know what happened. We would have no idea how much or how little this ping on the radar to Thanos would have affected his actions going forward. What if he downloaded the plan but didn't get to the planet before original Nebula left? Would he have caught and killed Star-Lord? We don't know. Now let's talk about Steve's time travel deviation from the plan. Steve goes back in time. Hulk, Falcon, and Bucky are all with him and waiting for him. Steve is supposed to basically just show up a second after leaving, but he doesn't. Then Bucky sees Steve from a distance sitting at a bench, and he's like super old. Steve most likely, on purpose, stayed behind somewhere in the past and aged out. Yet he was still there at the appointed time when younger him had gone to return the stones. So what happened? I really, really hate this ending, but we have to go through it. There's only two ways this could go. Assuming Steve returned all the stones in the vials, and we don't know if anything else went wrong during his trip. Maybe something went wrong and that's why he never came back. But at some point, based on the cars we see on the road, Steve went back to 1940-something and got that dance with Peggy. Then he aged to the point that he was an old man in the end of Avengers Endgame. So bottom line, either Steve was always meant to go back in time, live out his life, and that was always part of the original MCU timeline that we don't see, or Steve created a new timeline and then at some point used the time travel device to jump back to the original 2023 MCU timeline. In order for this deviation of the plan to have been part of the original timeline, it means Steve not telling anyone anything about anything. He had to sit back and watch all the bad stuff happen while pretending to be Steve Rogers' identical cousin or something. He had to leave Bucky to be tortured by the Russians for 70 years. Or maybe he did try to change the timeline and it kept resetting itself and he just gave up. Or he created a happy world for himself in this new timeline and then used Pym's time travel serum to jump to his original 2023 timeline when he knew the others would be there. Either one of these timeline theories implies that there are two Steve Rogers in the timeline. The original MCU Steve Rogers that went back in time and the one stuck in the ice. If Steve Rogers created a new timeline, would the 2011 discovery of Steve Rogers in the ice happen as it did in the original MCU? Does that mean that when Steve returns to 2023, he leaves behind a version of himself that is still young and joins the Avengers? And then goes back in time eventually and stays in the past, perpetuating an entire cycle of Steve Rogers living and then going back into the past to live out his life? I have to cut in here and remind myself and everyone that the TVA in the Loki series might have taken care of all of this. But since Steve is still old, I think that would imply that Steve was always meant to go back. This would imply that maybe the TVA fixed all the issues that arose with the timeline fracturing that happened thanks to the events of Avengers Endgame. And that means everything is back to normal. Steve Rogers is always meant to go back in time, and he didn't mess up the timeline. Thank you, TVA. However, Loki Season 1 ends in total chaos that implies that maybe all of these timelines happened. Now, I can't do this video without mentioning the way that the actual Avengers explain time travel. There's a whole scene where they explain it, and Rhodey is like, let's just go back in time and kill baby Thanos. And Hulk is like, you can't change the past to change the future. And Ant-Man is all like, we can just get the stones before Thanos gets them then. Hawkeye is like, yeah. Nebula's like, nope. Then Hawkeye, Rhodey, and Ant-Man are like, but all these Hollywood movies say it works this way. And to be fair, here's a glimpse of my Back to the Future timeline slide that says it really does work this way, at least in the Back to the Future universe. But Hulk is all like, if you travel to the past, that past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future. Now, when I was watching the movie, I could not understand that really at all, and I kind of had to see it in print so I could slow down and take it all in. So let me try to explain what I think he's talking about. And I'm going to explain it by using Hawkeye's timeline. So here is Hawkeye's timeline. Not the MCU timeline, I've been showing you this whole time, specifically the timeline of Hawkeye's life. After the time travel discussion I just summarized, Hawkeye does a test run with the time travel juice. This time travel jump is in Clint's future. He goes to the year 2017, give or take, and then after that trip to 2017, he goes to the year 2023 again, arriving soon after he left. Then after that, he travels to the year 2014 in order to get the Soul Stone. Then after that, he travels to 2023 again and lives out the rest of the film as we know it. Basically, Clint can't change the past and have it affect his future. Because, for example, when the movie started, visiting 2014 was in his future. That visit wasn't in his past. It's something that he did later on in the movie, later on in his life. I'm going to be honest, this is one of the most confusing time travel rationales I've ever come across. I think the way the TVA erased the Loki escape timeline and the way Steve aged himself out implies that there are ways you can get around the Hulk's explanation. However, I also want to say that despite how confusing Hulk's explanation sounded to me, I think the basic of it is to say that time isn't linear. We humans experience and perceive it linear, but as a great man once said, time is a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. And the bottom line is, the Avengers can't use the Pym juice and land in an alternate timeline. The device will always take them to their own original timeline, even if they somehow create alternates. And the Loki series and other post-Endgame MCU films show that alternate universes, the multiverse, things like that exist. They just aren't accessible with Pym's unintentional time travel secret formula particle juice. I'm really looking forward to how Loki season 2 explains any of this. So thank you for coming to my nerd talk. Comment down below.